The auctioneer's hammer trembled in his weathered hand as he gazed out at the desperate faces gathered in Millbrook's town square. What should have been a routine livestock auction had become something unthinkable. Parents clutching their children's hands, knowing they might never see them again. The autumn of 1934 had brought more than just falling leaves to this small Indiana farming community. It had brought a choice no parent should ever have to make. Watch your children starve, or give them a chance at life with strangers who could afford to feed them. But among the crowd of potential buyers stood a figure whose presence would change everything, a mysterious man in an expensive coat whose true identity would shake the very foundations of this desperate town. What happened next would be remembered for generations, though the full truth wouldn't emerge until the final, shocking revelation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden sign at the edge of Millbrook, Indiana, had once proudly proclaimed Population 847, Gateway to Prosperity. By October 1934, someone had painted over the words with stark black letters, God help us all. Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching her 7-year-old son, Tommy, chase their last remaining chicken around the barren vegetable garden. The sight that should have brought laughter instead filled her with dread. That chicken represented their family's final meal, and she knew Tommy was too young to understand why his mother had been crying every night for the past month. The Great Depression had hit rural Indiana like a plague, but Millbrook had suffered beyond what any community should endure. First came the bank failures that wiped out generations of savings, then the severe drought that killed 3 consecutive harvests. Finally, the devastating early frost that destroyed what little remained of their hope. But it wasn't just the economic devastation that had brought Millbrook to its knees. A mysterious blight had struck their remaining livestock, killing cattle, pigs, and chickens with unprecedented speed. The state agricultural inspectors who came to investigate had left shaking their heads, unable to identify the disease that was systematically destroying the town's last source of income and sustenance. Dr. Henry Walsh, the town's only physician, had delivered increasingly grim reports to the emergency town council meetings held in the basement of the Methodist Church. Children were showing signs of malnutrition. The elderly were weakening rapidly. If something didn't change within weeks, Millbrook would face its first winter deaths from starvation since its founding in 1847. "Mama, is Papa coming home today?" Tommy asked, bursting through the kitchen door with flushed cheeks and dirt-stained overalls. His thin frame broke Sarah's heart daily. At 7 years old, he should have been robust and energetic. Instead, his clothes hung loose on his shrinking body, and his eyes held a mature worry that no child should possess. "He's trying, sweetheart," Sarah replied, forcing brightness into her voice. "He went to Indianapolis to look for work. He'll come back as soon as he can." What Sarah didn't tell Tommy was that his father, James Mitchell, had been gone for 6 weeks with no word. Like dozens of other Millbrook men, he had left town seeking employment in the cities, hoping to earn enough money to send home for food. Some had found temporary work. Others had simply vanished into the anonymity of urban poverty. A few had sent heartbreaking letters explaining they couldn't return because they had nothing to offer their families. The sound of horses and wagon wheels on the dirt road drew Sarah's attention back to the window. Mayor Robert Coleman was making his rounds again, his face bearing the weight of impossible decisions. At 52, Coleman had aged a decade in the past year. His once prosperous general store stood empty, its shelves bare, its windows reflecting the hollow desperation of the entire community. Behind Coleman rode Dr. Walsh and Pastor William Anderson, the 3 men who had become Millbrook's unofficial crisis committee. Their expressions suggested they were not bringing good news to whatever household they planned to visit next. Sarah's stomach clenched as the wagon stopped in front of the Henderson farmhouse across the road. Mary Henderson emerged from her house, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, though Sarah knew there had been no flour in Millbrook for weeks. The gesture was pure habit, a remnant of better times when women actually baked bread and cooked substantial meals for their families. Through her window, Sarah could see the animated discussion between the officials and Mary Henderson. She watched. Mary's face crumble, watched her hands fly to her mouth in horror, watched her sink onto her front steps as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Whatever news the men had brought, it was devastating even by Millbrook's recent standards. 20 minutes later, the wagon approached Sarah's house. She met the men at her front door, Tommy hiding behind her skirts with the instinct of a child who had learned that adult conversations often brought bad news. "Sarah," Mayor Coleman began, his voice heavy with reluctance, "we need to talk." They gathered around Sarah's kitchen table, the same table where her family had once shared abundant meals and laughter. Now it served as a conference space for discussing survival strategies that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. "The situation has become critical," Dr. Walsh explained, his medical bag looking pathetically inadequate for the scope of Millbrook's problems. "I've examined 43 children in the past week. Every single one shows signs of malnutrition. The younger ones are beginning to show symptoms of kwashiorkor, severe protein deficiency." Pastor Anderson leaned forward, his usually comforting presence now radiating anxiety. "Sarah, we've been visiting every family in town today. We've had to make a decision that goes against everything we believe, everything we hold sacred." Sarah felt her world tilting. "What kind of decision?" Mayor Coleman cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the kitchen silence. "The town council met in emergency session last night. We've exhausted every option. We've contacted the state government, written to federal relief programs, appealed to every charity organization we can find. No help is coming in time." "In time for what?" Sarah whispered, though she feared she already knew. "Winter," Dr. Walsh said simply. "Sarah, based on the current rate of deterioration, we'll lose our first children to starvation within 3 weeks. The elderly even sooner. We can't wait any longer for outside help that may never come." Pastor Anderson's hands shook as he pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "We've made arrangements with an adoption agency in Chicago. They've agreed to organize an emergency placement auction for any families willing to part with their children temporarily." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. "An auction? You want us to auction our children?" "Not permanently," Mayor Coleman said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "The agreement states that when families are financially stable again, they can reclaim their children. It's a temporary measure, Sarah, a way to ensure the children survive until we can rebuild." Sarah stared at these men she had known and trusted her entire life. Men who had baptized her children, treated their illnesses, and helped her family through previous difficulties. Now they were asking her to consider selling her son to strangers. "Who would bid on them?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Families in Chicago, Indianapolis, and other cities where the depression hasn't hit as hard," Dr. Walsh explained. "People who want children but can't have their own, or who want to help. The adoption agency has assured us they'll screen all potential families carefully." Tommy tugged on Sarah's dress, sensing the tension in the room. "Mama, what's an auction?" Sarah picked up her son, holding him close while the men continued their explanation. She breathed in his scent, memorized the feel of his small body against hers, and tried to imagine life without his laughter filling their empty house. "When would this happen?" she heard herself ask. "This Saturday," Pastor Anderson replied. "We're holding it in the town square. Every family has until Friday evening to decide whether to participate. After the men left, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen while Tommy napped upstairs. The house felt tomb-like in its silence. She walked through the rooms, noting the sold furniture, the empty pantry, the threadbare curtains that had once been her pride. Everything of value had already been bartered for food or fuel. She found herself in Tommy's bedroom, watching him sleep. His face, peaceful in slumber, still held the innocence of childhood despite the hardships surrounding him. His favorite wooden horse, carved by his father the previous Christmas, sat on the windowsill, one of the few toys they hadn't sold. That evening, Sarah walked through downtown Millbrook, observing the evidence of their collective desperation. The pharmacy had closed permanently, its windows boarded over. The schoolhouse stood empty because there was no money to pay the teacher. Even the church had shortened its services because Pastor Anderson couldn't afford to heat the building properly. She encountered other mothers making the same terrible calculations. Emma Rodriguez, who worked as a seamstress when anyone could afford alterations, sat on her front porch staring at nothing while her twin daughters played in the dirt. Margaret Foster, whose husband had died in a farming accident the previous spring, rocked her infant son while her 4-year-old daughter asked repeatedly when they would eat dinner. "Sarah," Emma called softly as she passed, "did they talk to you too?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "What choice do we have?" Margaret Foster approached them, her baby crying weakly against her shoulder. "I heard there's a man coming from Chicago, someone with enough money to bid on multiple children. They say he's looking to start some kind of organization." The women fell silent, each lost in their own impossible thoughts. The idea of a stranger taking multiple children from their community felt both terrifying and somehow more hopeful than scattering them among various unknown families. As Sarah walked home through the gathering darkness, she noticed lights burning in windows throughout Millbrook. Families were having conversations no parent should ever have to endure. Children were being told, in careful terms, that they might go live with other people for a while. Mothers were packing small suitcases with their children's few remaining possessions. By Friday evening, 37 families had made the devastating decision to participate in Saturday's auction. 37 families had chosen their children's survival over their own hearts. Sarah had added Tommy's name to the list. The night before the auction, Millbrook's children gathered in the Methodist church for what Pastor Anderson called a blessing ceremony. In reality, it was a goodbye that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Children who had played together since birth, who had attended the same one-room schoolhouse, who had grown up as surrogate siblings in their small community, were saying farewell, without understanding the permanence of their separation. Sarah held Tommy's hand as they walked home from the church, his small fingers intertwined with hers. He had asked why all the grown-ups were crying, why his friend Lucy was going to live with strangers, why he couldn't just stay home with his mama. "Sometimes," Sarah had told him, "people have to be very brave and do scary things so that good things can happen later. Will good things happen to us, Mama?" Sarah had promised they would, though she no longer believed in the possibility of good things for anyone in Millbrook. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that had once meant harvest festivals and community celebrations. Instead, it brought the unthinkable, parents preparing to bid farewell to their children in the desperate hope that strangers might offer what they could no longer provide. As Sarah helped Tommy into his best clothes, now too large for his shrinking frame, she wondered if this mysterious benefactor from Chicago would truly care for the children he purchased, or if Millbrook was simply trading one form of tragedy for another. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The town square of Millbrook had been transformed overnight into something resembling a livestock market, though everyone present tried desperately to ignore the comparison. Makeshift wooden platforms had been erected in front of the courthouse steps, while rows of chairs, borrowed from the church, formed a semicircle around the auction area. A large banner stretched between two oak trees read, "Emergency Child Placement Auction, October 27th, 1934. By 8 o'clock that morning, carriages and automobiles began arriving from neighboring counties and distant cities. Word of Millbrook's desperate situation had spread through networks of adoption agencies, charitable organizations, and wealthy families seeking children. Sarah Mitchell watched from her kitchen window as strangers walked through her dying town, some with genuine compassion in their eyes, others with the calculating expressions of people examining merchandise. The sight that struck her most forcefully was the contrast between the visitors and Millbrook's residents. The outsiders wore clean, well-fitted clothing, carried leather purses and polished briefcases, and moved with the confident bearing of people who had never questioned where their next meal would come from. Meanwhile, Millbrook's families clustered together in their patched clothing and worn shoes, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed exhaustion of prolonged hunger. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, quietly eating a bowl of thin oatmeal that represented the last of their breakfast supplies. He had dressed himself in his Sunday clothes without being asked, somehow understanding the solemnity of the day, even if he couldn't grasp its full implications. "Mama," he said, looking up from his bowl, "will the people who take me be nice?" Sarah knelt beside his chair, fighting back tears she had promised herself she wouldn't shed in front of him. "I hope so, sweetheart. I pray they will love you the way you deserve to be loved." "Will they have enough food?" The innocent question broke Sarah's heart. Her 7-year-old son had learned to worry about food security in ways that no child should understand. "Yes, Tommy, they'll have plenty of food." At 9:30, a commotion outside drew Sarah's attention back to the window. A magnificent black automobile was pulling into the town square, its chrome fixtures gleaming in the morning sunlight. The vehicle was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen, clearly expensive, modern, and meticulously maintained. It stopped near the auction platform, and the driver, a well-dressed man in his 30s, stepped out to open the rear door. The man who emerged commanded immediate attention. Tall and distinguished, probably in his early 50s, he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried himself with quiet authority. His silver hair was neatly styled, and his face, though stern, held an indefinable quality that suggested both intelligence and hidden depths. Most remarkably, he carried no briefcase, no adoption paperwork, no visible indication of his intentions. Sarah watched as Mayor Coleman hurried over to greet the newcomer, their conversation too distant to overhear. Whatever the stranger said caused Coleman's expression to shift from nervous hospitality to stunned amazement. The mayor gestured emphatically, apparently trying to explain something, while the mysterious man simply nodded and handed him what appeared to be a bank draft. Other potential bidders had begun gathering around the platforms, examining lists of the children available for placement. Sarah noticed a well-dressed woman from Indianapolis studying the descriptions with the focused attention of someone making a significant purchase decision. A Chicago businessman discussed financial arrangements with the adoption agency representative. A farming couple from Ohio compared notes about which children might be best suited for agricultural work. But the mysterious man in the expensive suit remained apart from these activities, standing alone near his automobile and observing the proceedings with an unreadable expression. At exactly 10 o'clock, Pastor Anderson stepped onto the main platform and called for attention. His voice, usually strong and comforting during Sunday sermons, wavered with emotion as he began the opening ceremony. "Friends, neighbors, and visitors," he began, "we gather today not in celebration, but in desperation. What we are about to do goes against every natural instinct of parenthood, every principle of family unity that we hold sacred. But we do it because we love our children more than we love ourselves, and because love sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of Millbrook residents, while the visiting bidders maintained respectful silence. Before we begin, Pastor Anderson continued, I want to establish the rules that will govern today's proceedings. Each child will be presented individually. Bidding will start at $50, with the understanding that this money will be used to help sustain the remaining community members through the winter. Most importantly, this is not a sale of human beings. These are placement arrangements, with the understanding that families may reclaim their children when economic conditions improve. The first child called was Lucy Henderson, a shy 6-year-old with blonde pigtails and wide blue eyes. Mary Henderson accompanied her daughter to the platform, whispering words of encouragement while fighting back tears. Lucy clutched a rag doll that had clearly seen better days, her only comfort in an incomprehensible situation. Lucy is 6 years old, announced the adoption agency representative, a businesslike woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had arrived from Chicago the previous day. She's in good health, knows her letters and numbers, and is described by her teacher as exceptionally well-behaved and eager to learn. The bidding began tentatively. The farming couple from Ohio offered $50. The Indianapolis woman countered with $60. A childless couple from Fort Wayne raised it to $75. Then the mysterious man stepped forward. $500, he said clearly, his voice carrying across the silent square. The effect was electric. The other bidders turned to stare at him in shock. $500 was more than many families in Millbrook had seen in an entire year, even before the economic collapse. It was 10 times the previous high bid and suggested resources beyond anything the community had imagined. "Sir," Mrs. Patterson said, clearly flustered, "are you certain of that amount?" "Quite certain," the man replied calmly. No one else attempted to match the bid. Lucy Henderson was placed with the mysterious Benefactor, though the transaction felt surreal to everyone present. Mary Henderson hugged her daughter goodbye, whispering promises they might never be able to keep, while Lucy stared up at her new guardian with the solemn acceptance of a child who had learned that adults made decisions she couldn't control. The pattern continued with devastating consistency. Each child was presented. Modest bidding would begin among the various families present, and then the mysterious man would make an offer so substantial that no one else could compete. $50 became $500. $100 became $1,000. By the fourth child, he was bidding amounts that exceeded the annual income of most professional families. Sarah watched in growing amazement and confusion as Tommy's friends were claimed one by this enigmatic figure. There was something almost ritualistic about his approach. He never haggled, never negotiated, never even examined the children closely. He simply made his bid and waited for the inevitable result. "Who is he?" whispered Emma Rodriguez, who stood beside Sarah in the crowd of parents. "I don't know," Sarah replied, "but he's buying all of them." Indeed, by noon, the mysterious Benefactor had successfully bid on 17 children, spending what Mayor Coleman estimated to be over $12,000. The money was more than Millbrook's entire municipal budget for the previous 5 years combined. It was enough to purchase food and supplies that could sustain the remaining community through the winter and possibly into the following spring. But more puzzling than his wealth was his manner. Unlike the other bidders, who asked detailed questions about the children's health, temperament, and abilities, the mysterious man seemed entirely uninterested in such practical concerns. He bid with the detached efficiency of someone fulfilling a predetermined plan rather than someone selecting children to raise. When Tommy's name was called, Sarah felt her legs wobble. She walked with her son to the platform, acutely aware that this might be their final moments together. Tommy looked up at her with trust and confusion, still not fully understanding why his mother was delivering him to strangers. Thomas Mitchell, age 7, Mrs. Patterson announced. Healthy, intelligent, well-mannered. His teacher reports excellent progress in reading and arithmetic. The familiar bidding pattern began. $50 from a farming family, $75 from a couple seeking a son, $100 from a widow who wanted a child to care for in her declining years. Then the mysterious man spoke again. $2,000. The amount was so extraordinary that several people gasped audibly. $2,000 could feed a family. For years, could buy a small farm, could change someone's entire life circumstances. For a 7-year-old boy, it seemed impossible to comprehend. Sarah stared at this stranger who was about to become her son's guardian. Up close, she could see details that hadn't been visible from a distance. His hands, though soft, bore the faint calluses of someone who had once performed manual labor. His suit, while expensive, was conservative rather than flashy. Most intriguingly, his eyes held a sadness that seemed familiar, as if he understood, loss in ways that went beyond financial transactions. "Sir," Sarah found herself saying, though she hadn't planned to speak, "may I ask, what are your intentions for these children?" The question seemed to surprise him. For the first time all day, his composed facade flickered slightly, revealing something that might have been emotion. "Ma'am," he replied quietly, "I intend to give them what they need." It was not a complete answer, but something in his tone reassured Sarah in ways she couldn't explain. When she hugged Tommy goodbye, she whispered, "Be brave, sweetheart. Remember that Mama loves you more than all the stars in the sky." Tommy nodded solemnly and walked over to stand with the growing group of children who now belonged, at least temporarily, to the mysterious benefactor. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the unthinkable had been completed. 37 children had been separated from their families, and 36 of them now stood in a cluster around the black automobile, their small suitcases and treasured possessions creating a pile of heartbreaking evidence of their displacement. Only one child had been claimed by someone else, a teenage boy whose uncle from Kentucky had managed to outbid the mysterious man with an offer of family placement rather than money. The mysterious benefactor had spent over $28,000, an amount so staggering that Mayor Coleman had to telegraph the bank in Indianapolis to verify that the bank drafts were genuine. The money was real, and it was enough to purchase supplies that could sustain Millbrook through the winter and potentially fund the community's economic recovery. But as the children prepared to leave with their mysterious guardian, questions multiplied rather than diminished. Where was he taking them? What kind of life awaited them? Why had he come to Millbrook specifically, and how had he known about their desperate situation? The man himself remained maddeningly enigmatic. He spoke briefly with Mrs. Patterson about transportation arrangements, ensuring that the children would be comfortable during their journey. He personally loaded their belongings into a second vehicle that had arrived to accommodate the unexpected volume of luggage. He even distributed candy to the younger children, though his manner remained distant and businesslike. As the convoy of vehicles prepared to depart, Sarah ran toward the black automobile where Tommy sat in the back seat, his face pressed against the window. She placed her palm against the glass, and he mirrored the gesture from inside, their hands separated by barrier that felt as vast as an ocean. "I'll find you," she mouthed, though she had no idea how such a promise could ever be fulfilled. The mysterious man noticed this exchange and approached Sarah with measured steps. Up close, she could see that his eyes were brown with flecks of gold, and that his stern expression couldn't entirely hide an underlying gentleness. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "your son will be well cared for. You have my word. But where Are you taking them? How will we know they're safe? For a moment, the man seemed to struggle with how much to reveal. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, though he held it without offering it to her. "When you're ready," he said cryptically, "when your community has recovered, you'll understand everything. The children will understand everything. Until then, please trust that they are not lost to you forever." He handed her the card and returned to his automobile before Sarah could ask more questions. She looked down at the simple white card bearing only a name, Jonathan Westbrook, and an address in Chicago. As the vehicles disappeared down Millbrook's main road, carrying away an entire generation of the town's children, Sarah stood in the empty town square, clutching the business card and trying to process what had just occurred. Around her, other parents were experiencing the same mixture of relief and devastation, grateful for their children's chance at survival while mourning their absence. The mysterious benefactor had solved Millbrook's immediate crisis, but he had also created a new mystery that would haunt the community until the truth was finally revealed. Who was Jonathan Westbrook, and what did he really want with 36 children from a dying farming town? The answer would change everything the people of Millbrook thought they knew about desperation, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. The silence that descended upon Millbrook after the departure of Jonathan Westbrook's convoy was unlike anything the community had ever experienced. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, but the absence of life itself. No children's laughter echoed from the playground behind the schoolhouse. No small feet ran down the wooden sidewalks. No young voices called to friends or asked parents the endless questions that had once filled their days with purpose. Within hours of the auction's conclusion, Mayor Coleman found himself facing a crisis he hadn't anticipated. The money from Jonathan Westbrook was indeed real, $28,400 in verified bank drafts. But the psychological impact on the remaining adults was devastating. Parents wandered their empty houses like ghosts, touching their children's abandoned toys and staring at beds that would remain empty indefinitely. Dr. Henry Walsh made emergency house calls throughout the evening, treating what he grimly noted as symptoms of collective trauma. Emma Rodriguez hadn't spoken a word since watching her twin daughters disappear down the road. Margaret Foster sat rocking an empty cradle, humming lullabies to a baby who was no longer there. Even the men who had prided themselves on stoic endurance throughout the economic crisis showed signs of emotional collapse. "We may have saved their bodies," Pastor Anderson confided to Dr. Walsh as they met in the church that evening, "but I fear we've destroyed their souls. And ours." The first real test of the community's resilience came the following Monday morning, when the supply wagons arrived from Indianapolis. Mayor Coleman had used a portion of Westbrook's money to purchase immediate necessities: flour, dried beans, canned goods, winter clothing, and medical supplies. The sight of actual abundance after months of deprivation should have brought celebration. Instead, it brought guilt. Sarah Mitchell stood in the town's makeshift distribution center, staring at shelves lined with food her son would never taste. She picked up a can of peaches, Tommy's favorite treat, and felt tears she thought she had exhausted begin flowing again. How could she enjoy plenty when her child might be hungry somewhere in Chicago? "Sarah," a gentle voice said behind her. She turned to find Ruth Campbell, the widow who ran the town's tiny library. Ruth was one of the few residents who hadn't had children to auction, making her a neutral presence in the community's current atmosphere of shared grief. "I've been thinking about that man," Ruth continued, lowering her voice as if discussing a dangerous secret. "Jonathan Westbrook. Something about him didn't sit right with me." Sarah wiped her eyes and focused on Ruth's words. "What do you mean?" "I was watching him during the auction, really watching. He wasn't looking at the children the way other bidders were. He was looking at us, the parents, like he was studying our faces, memorizing our reactions. This observation struck Sarah as significant, though she couldn't yet understand why. "Do you think he was some kind of researcher, someone studying poverty?" Ruth shook her head. "No, it was more personal than that. Sarah, I think that man has been to Millbrook before." The suggestion seemed impossible. Millbrook was not the kind of place that attracted visitors, especially not wealthy businessmen from Chicago. The town's isolation was part of what had made their situation so desperate. They were too far from major cities to benefit from urban relief programs, too small to warrant government attention. But Ruth's comment planted a seed of curiosity that began growing throughout the week. Other residents started sharing their own observations about the mysterious benefactor. Frank Morrison, who ran the town's gas station, remembered seeing a similar black automobile parked outside the town limits several months earlier. Mrs. Helen Davies, the postmistress, recalled an unusual inquiry about Millbrook's population, records that had come through official channels the previous spring. Most intriguingly, old Timothy Fletcher, who had lived in Millbrook longer than anyone else, claimed that Jonathan Westbrook's face had seemed familiar. Though he couldn't place where he might have encountered him, these fragments of information might have remained isolated observations, if not for an unexpected discovery made by Sarah Mitchell while cleaning out her attic in search of items to sell for additional income. Among her late mother's papers, she found a wooden box containing family photographs dating back to the town's founding. As she sorted through the sepia-tinted images, one photograph stopped her cold. The picture, dated 1887, showed the dedication ceremony for Millbrook's first school building. Among the crowd of settlers and dignitaries stood a young man whose features bore an unmistakable resemblance to Jonathan Westbrook. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, even the same way of holding his shoulders suggested a family connection that spanned generations. Sarah rushed the photograph to Ruth Campbell, who examined it with the meticulous attention to detail that made her an excellent librarian. Ruth's conclusion was startling. The young man in the 1887 photograph could easily have been Jonathan Westbrook's father or grandfather. "Sarah," Ruth said slowly, "I think we need to research this man's connection to our town, and I know exactly where to start." The next morning, Ruth embarked on what she called detective work, though it required nothing more sophisticated than careful examination of Millbrook's historical records. The town's founding documents, stored in the courthouse basement, revealed information that had been forgotten by current residents, but which might explain Jonathan Westbrook's mysterious appearance. Millbrook had been established in 1847 by a consortium of investors led by a man named Jeremiah Westbrook, who had purchased a large tract of land from the federal government and recruited settlers to establish a farming community. The Westbrook family had been instrumental in the town's early development, contributing funds for the school, the church, and the main commercial buildings. But according to the records, the Westbrook family had left Millbrook abruptly in 1889, selling their holdings to local residents and departing for Chicago. The reason for their departure was documented in a series of increasingly desperate letters from Jeremiah Westbrook to various state and federal officials pleading for assistance during what appeared to have been an earlier agricultural crisis. "Sarah," Ruth explained as they pored over the faded documents, "Jeremiah Westbrook watched his community suffer from crop failures and economic hardship remarkably similar to what we've just experienced. But back then, there was no help coming. No government programs, no charitable organizations. The family left because they couldn't bear to watch their neighbors starve. The parallels were unmistakable. Just as the current residents of Millbrook had been forced to make impossible choices about their children's survival, Jeremiah Westbrook had faced the devastating reality that good intentions and personal wealth were insufficient to save an entire community from forces beyond anyone's control. But the historical records revealed something else that sent chills down Sarah's spine. Among Jeremiah Westbrook's papers was a handwritten note, apparently written shortly before the family's departure. "I swear by all that is holy that if this community ever again faces such suffering, the Westbrook family will not abandon it. We will return, and we will do whatever is necessary to preserve these good people and their children." "It's him," Sarah whispered, staring at the faded handwriting. "Jonathan Westbrook is Jeremiah's descendant, and he's fulfilling a promise made almost 50 years ago." The realization reframed everything about the mysterious benefactor's behavior during the auction. His knowledge of Millbrook's situation, his apparent financial preparation for exactly this type of crisis, his systematic bidding on nearly every child, all of it suggested not random charity, but the execution of a long-planned family obligation. But understanding Westbrook's motivations didn't answer the most pressing question: what was happening to the children right now? That answer began to emerge through an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the auction, Mayor Coleman received a telegram that would change everything the community thought they knew about their children's fate. Millbrook children, safe and well, attending school and receiving excellent care. Comprehensive report to follow. Families welcome to visit at any time. Jonathan Westbrook, Westbrook Educational Foundation, Chicago. The telegram raised more questions than it answered. What was the Westbrook Educational Foundation? Why were the children attending school instead of being placed with individual families? And most importantly, what did Westbrook mean by inviting families to visit? Dr. Walsh, who had been monitoring the mental health of the bereft parents, immediately recognized the telegram's potential therapeutic value. "These people need to see their children," he told Mayor Coleman. "They need to know the children are truly safe and well cared for." But organizing a trip to Chicago seemed impossible. The remaining community members had limited resources, and traveling such a distance required money they couldn't spare, despite Westbrook's generous payment for the children's placement. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. Pastor Anderson received a visit from a representative of the Indiana Conference of Methodist Churches, who had learned about Millbrook's situation through denominational networks. The conference offered to fund a trip to Chicago for a small delegation of parents, both to verify the children's welfare and to better understand this unusual arrangement. Sarah Mitchell was chosen as one of the 3 parents who would make the journey, along with Emma Rodriguez and Frank Morrison, whose son David had been among the children claimed by Westbrook. The trip was scheduled for the first week of November, exactly 2 weeks after the auction that had changed all their lives. As Sarah prepared for the journey to Chicago, she found herself experiencing a mixture of hope and dread that was almost unbearable. She wanted desperately to see Tommy, to verify that he was safe and healthy and being treated well. But she also feared what she might discover about the man who now controlled her son's fate. The business card Jonathan Westbrook had given her, simple white cardstock bearing only his name and a Chicago address, had become her most treasured possession. She had memorized every detail of its typography, every slight imperfection in its printing. It represented her only connection to Tommy, her only hope of understanding what had really happened on that terrible October day when Millbrook had been forced to auction its own children. The night before her departure for Chicago, Sarah stood in Tommy's empty bedroom, holding his wooden horse and trying to imagine what kind of life he was living now. Was he sleeping in a comfortable bed? Did he have enough to eat? Were there other children for him to play with? Most importantly, did he understand that his mother had sent him away out of love, not abandonment? Tomorrow would bring answers to at least some of these questions. But Sarah suspected that what she discovered in Chicago would be far more complex. and surprising than anything she could currently imagine. Jonathan Westbrook's true identity and his connection to Millbrook was just the beginning of a story that would ultimately reveal the extraordinary lengths to which one family had gone to honor a promise made in desperation nearly half a century earlier. The mysterious benefactor who had appeared in their darkest hour was about to reveal himself as something far more significant than a wealthy stranger with charitable impulses. He was the living embodiment of a multi-generational commitment to justice, redemption, and the belief that no community should ever have to sacrifice its children to survive. The train journey from Indianapolis to Chicago felt endless to Sarah Mitchell, despite lasting only 6 hours. She sat rigidly in her seat, clutching Tommy's wooden horse and staring out the window at landscapes that grew increasingly urban as they approached their destination. Beside her, Emma Rodriguez maintained an equally tense silence, while Frank Morrison paced the aisle with nervous energy that drew disapproving looks from other passengers. None of them had ever been to a city as large as Chicago. The sight of towering buildings, endless streets filled with automobiles, and crowds of people moving with purposeful urgency was overwhelming. Sarah found herself wondering how her small son was adapting to such an alien environment after growing up in rural Millbrook, where he knew every face and every building. The address on Jonathan Westbrook's business card led them to an unexpected location in Chicago's affluent North Shore district. Instead of finding an office building or adoption agency, they discovered themselves standing before the gates of what appeared to be a sprawling estate, a brass nameplate embedded in the stone. Gateposts read, "Westbrook Educational Foundation, established 1889. The timing struck Sarah immediately. 1889 was the same year Jeremiah Westbrook had left Millbrook, according to the historical records Ruth Campbell had uncovered. The connection was becoming clearer, though its full implications remained mysterious. A uniformed guard approached them from a small building inside the gates. He was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put the nervous parents somewhat at ease. "You must be the visitors from Millbrook," he said warmly. "Mr. Westbrook has been expecting you." "I'm Henry Barnes, head of security here. Please, come with me." As they walked through the gates, Sarah gasped at what lay before them. The estate was enormous, featuring multiple buildings connected by tree-lined pathways and carefully maintained gardens, but this was clearly not a private residence. The buildings had the institutional appearance of a school or college campus, with large windows, multiple entrances, and the kind of architectural design intended to accommodate many people. "Mr. Barnes," Emma Rodriguez asked hesitantly. "What exactly is this place?" Barnes smiled as he led them along a paved walkway. "The Westbrook Educational Foundation operates the most comprehensive residential school for displaced children in the Midwest. We currently house and educate over 200 children from various crisis situations throughout the region. 200 children. The number was staggering. Sarah had assumed that Tommy and his Millbrook friends would be among a small group of children in Westbrook's care. Instead, they were apparently part of a vast operation that had been helping displaced children for decades. "How long has this been operating?" Frank Morrison asked. "Since 1889, Barnes replied, confirming Sarah's growing suspicions about the timeline. "Mr. Jeremiah Westbrook founded the institution after experiencing a personal tragedy that made him devoted to protecting children from the consequences of economic hardship. His son and grandson have continued that mission." They passed a large brick building from which the sounds of children's voices could be heard. Sarah's heart leaped at the possibility that one of those voices might belong to Tommy, but Barnes continued walking toward what appeared to be the main administrative building. "The children from Millbrook," Sarah said urgently. "Are they here? Are they safe?" "They are completely safe," Barnes assured her. "Mr. Westbrook will explain everything, but I can tell you that your children have adapted remarkably well to their new environment. They're attending classes, making friends, and receiving the kind of comprehensive care that most institutions can't provide." The main building's interior was even more impressive than its exterior. The lobby featured polished marble floors, detailed woodwork and oil paintings depicting pastoral scenes that reminded Sarah of the countryside around Millbrook. Everything spoke of wealth and permanence, but also of genuine care and attention to creating a welcoming environment. Jonathan Westbrook emerged from an office to greet them personally. He appeared less formal than he had during the auction, wearing a simple suit instead of his previous expensive attire. His manner was warmer as well, though Sarah detected an underlying nervousness that suggested this meeting was as important to him as it was to the visiting parents. "Mrs. Mitchell, Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Morrison," he said, shaking each of their hands in turn. "Thank you for making the journey to Chicago. I know you must have many questions about your children's situation." "Where are they?" Emma asked immediately. "Can we see them?" "Of course," Westbrook replied, "but first I'd like to explain what the Westbrook Educational Foundation does and why your children are here. I think understanding our mission will help you feel more confident about their placement." He led them into a comfortable conference room lined with photographs showing children engaged in various educational and recreational activities. Sarah studied the images, looking for any sign of Tommy or his friends among the hundreds of faces displayed. "My grandfather, Jeremiah Westbrook, founded Millbrook with the dream of creating a self-sufficient farming community," Jonathan began. "When that community faced economic collapse in the late 1880s, he was forced to watch neighbors' children suffer from malnutrition and inadequate schooling. Families began leaving Millbrook, scattering to cities where children often ended up in factory work or worse situations. The parallels to their current situation were unmistakable, though Sarah noticed that Westbrook's version of events was more detailed than what the historical records had revealed. "My grandfather made a commitment that if he ever possessed the resources to prevent such suffering, he would create an institution dedicated to providing comprehensive care for displaced children. The Westbrook Educational Foundation is the fulfillment of that promise." Frank Morrison leaned forward. "But what exactly do you do with the children? Are you placing them with families?" Westbrook's expression grew more animated as he described the Foundation's approach. "We don't simply place children with families, Mr. Morrison. We educate them. We prepare them for futures that their original circumstances might not have allowed. Every child who comes here receives schooling equivalent to the finest private academies, along with vocational training, healthcare, and emotional support." He gestured to one of the photographs showing teenagers working in what appeared to be a well-equipped workshop. "Our older students learn practical skills like carpentry, mechanics, and agricultural science. Our younger students focus on academics, but they also participate in music, art, and physical education programs." Sarah found herself impressed, despite her reservations. "How long do children typically stay here?" "That depends entirely on their family's circumstances," Westbrook replied. "Some return home within a year when their families achieve stability. Others complete their entire education here and then choose their own paths as adults. A few, even, return to work for the Foundation, helping the next generation of displaced children." The concept was far more sophisticated than anything Sarah had imagined. Instead of simply rescuing children from immediate danger, Westbrook was providing them with opportunities that might actually improve their long-term prospects beyond what they could have achieved in Millbrook even during prosperous times. "But surely," Emma interjected, "there must be some cost to families. How do you fund such an extensive operation?" Westbrook's smile became slightly sad. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the Westbrook family fortune was built on railroad investments and Chicago real estate. We have more money than we could spend in several lifetimes. The foundation is our family's way of ensuring that wealth serves a meaningful purpose. Before anyone could ask more questions, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Children's voices were approaching, along with the sound of footsteps and animated conversation. Sarah's heart began racing as she recognized familiar tones among the mix of voices. "They're returning from their afternoon activities," Westbrook explained, checking his pocket watch. "Would you like to see them now?" The parents nodded eagerly, and Westbrook led them to a large window overlooking what appeared to be the main entrance to the educational buildings. Below them, dozens of children were filing through the doorways, their faces bright with the kind of energy that comes from engaging in activities they enjoy. Sarah scanned the crowd frantically until she spotted a familiar figure. Tommy was walking, with a group of boys roughly his age, carrying what appeared to be an art project and chatting animatedly with a dark-haired boy she didn't recognize. He looked healthy, well-dressed in clean clothes that actually fit him properly, and most importantly, he was smiling. "Oh my God," she whispered, pressing her palm against the window. "He looks happy." Emma had found her twin daughters in the crowd as well. The girls were holding hands as they usually did, but they were surrounded by other children their age and appeared to be part of a larger social group rather than clinging to each other out of necessity. Frank Morrison pointed to his son David, who was carrying a book under one arm and appeared to be explaining something enthusiastically to several younger children who were listening with rapt attention. "They look like different children," Frank observed, though his tone held wonder rather than concern. "They are different children in many ways," Westbrook confirmed. "When children are freed from the stress of hunger and uncertainty, when they're given opportunities to learn and grow, their natural personalities can flourish. Your children are becoming who they were always meant to be." Sarah watched Tommy for several more minutes, noting details that both relieved and surprised her. He had gained weight, filling out his clothes in a way that spoke of regular, nutritious meals. His hair had been cut and styled, giving him a neat appearance that was entirely different from his previous somewhat wild look. Most significantly, his body language suggested confidence and comfort rather than the wariness that had characterized him during Millbrook's final difficult months. "When can we talk to them?" she asked. "Right now, if you'd like," Westbrook replied. "I should warn you, though, that they may react differently than you expect. The children have been told that their families sent them here because you love them and want them to have opportunities you couldn't provide. They understand that this placement might be temporary, but they also know that returning to Millbrook depends on the community's recovery." The implications of this explanation struck Sarah forcefully. Tommy didn't think he had been abandoned or sold. He thought he had been given a gift. The psychological framework was entirely different from what she had feared during the weeks of separation. "Mr. Westbrook," she said slowly, "how did you know to prepare for our situation? The auction happened very quickly after you arrived in Millbrook." Westbrook's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Mitchell, the Westbrook family has been monitoring conditions in Millbrook for years. We have contacts throughout rural Indiana who report on communities facing economic hardship. When we learned about the severity of your situation, I came immediately to assess whether intervention was necessary." The revelation was startling. The mysterious benefactor hadn't appeared by chance or even in response to newspaper reports about their crisis. He had been watching Millbrook, waiting for exactly the type of emergency that had forced them to consider auctioning their children. "You've been watching us?" Emma asked, her tone reflecting uncertainty about whether this surveillance was comforting or disturbing. "Not watching in an intrusive sense," Westbrook clarified quickly. "But yes, we maintain awareness of communities that might need assistance. Millbrook has special significance for our family because of my grandfather's connection to the town. We've always considered ourselves to have ongoing obligations there." Before the parents could process the full implications of this admission, the door to the conference room opened, and Henry Barnes appeared with 3 children in tow. Tommy, along with Emma's daughters Maria and Sophia, entered the room with expressions of curious excitement rather than the traumatic reunion Sarah had been dreading. "Mama!" Tommy exclaimed, running to Sarah with obvious joy. "You came to see our school. Wait until you see my classroom and the library and the workshop where we're learning to build things." As Sarah held her son, breathing in the scent of soap and sunshine that clung to his hair, she realized that whatever Jonathan Westbrook had done, it was far more complex and benevolent than a simple adoption or placement service. He had created something that was transforming these children's lives in ways that would have been impossible in Millbrook even before the economic collapse. But as Tommy began enthusiastically describing his new life, Sarah found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. The question was no longer whether her son was safe and well cared for. The question was whether bringing him back to Millbrook would actually serve his best interests, even if the community did recover from its current crisis. The dormitory where Tommy lived was unlike anything Sarah had imagined when she'd worried about her son sleeping among strangers. The long, airy room housed 20 boys between the ages of 6 and 10, each with his own bed, dresser, and small desk for personal belongings. The walls were painted in warm colors and decorated with artwork created by the children themselves. Large windows provided natural light, and the entire space felt more like a summer camp cabin than an institutional dormitory. Tommy's bed was neatly made, and his small desk displayed treasures that told the story of his adaptation to this new life. Pressed leaves from nature walks, a photograph of his dormitory mates, several books that were clearly beyond his previous reading level and prominently placed in the center. The wooden horse his father had carved for him the previous Christmas. "I keep it right there so I can see it every morning when I wake up," Tommy explained to Sarah as she examined his living space. "It helps me remember Papa and you and our house in Millbrook." The comment was meant to be reassuring, but it struck Sarah with unexpected pain. Tommy's life in Millbrook had become a memory to be preserved rather than a reality to which he expected to return. He spoke about his former home with the same nostalgic affection that adults might reserve for childhood reminiscences. "Tommy," she said carefully, "do you miss home?" Her son considered the question with a seriousness that seemed beyond his 7 years. "I miss you and Papa," he said finally, "but Mama, I love it here. I'm learning so many things I never knew existed. Did you know there are books about children who live in places with no farms at all, just big buildings everywhere?" Sarah nodded, though her heart was breaking at the enthusiasm in his voice. This was what she had hoped for when she made the devastating decision to include his name on the auction list, that he would find safety, nourishment, and opportunities for growth. But she hadn't anticipated how completely he would embrace his new circumstances, or how difficult it would be to envision bringing him back to Millbrook's limited possibilities. Jonathan Westbrook had arranged for the visiting parents to spend 3 full days at the foundation, participating in their children's daily routines and observing the educational programs firsthand. What they discovered challenged every assumption they had made about institutional childcare. The academic program was extraordinary. Children were grouped not just by age, but by ability and interest, allowing each student to progress at their own pace. Tommy was reading at a level that would have been considered advanced for 10-year-olds in Millbrook's one-room schoolhouse. Maria and Sofia Rodriguez were exploring mathematics concepts that their former teacher had never even heard of. But the education extended far beyond traditional subjects. Every child participated in music instruction, choosing from piano, violin, or vocal training. Our classes used materials and techniques that most rural children would never encounter: Physical education included not just basic exercise, but swimming in an indoor pool, gymnastics and organized sports. Most remarkably, the children were learning practical life skills that would serve them regardless of their eventual paths. Older students managed their own laundry, prepared meals under supervision, and maintained detailed budgets for their personal expenses. Even the younger children, like Tommy, participated in age-appropriate versions of these activities, learning responsibility and independence in ways that impressed their visiting parents. "Mrs. Mitchell," said Miss Catherine Barnes, Tommy's primary teacher and Henry Barnes's daughter, "your son has shown remarkable aptitude for mechanical subjects. He's already mastered basic carpentry skills and shows genuine interest in how machines work. With proper training, he could become an engineer or inventor." The suggestion was both thrilling and heartbreaking. In Millbrook, Tommy's future would likely have involved farming or perhaps working in a trade if he was fortunate. The idea that he might pursue professional careers that required extensive education had never been a realistic possibility for a farming family struggling to survive. Emma Rodriguez faced similar revelations about her daughters. Maria had demonstrated exceptional musical talent, while Sophia showed promise in what Miss Barnes called scientific observation, a careful attention to detail and logical thinking that could lead to careers in research or medicine. Frank Morrison discovered that his son David had been identified as a natural leader, already helping younger children with their studies and organizing recreational activities. The Foundation's staff spoke about David's potential for advanced education and eventual roles in business or public service. These discoveries created an emotional conflict that none of the parents had anticipated. They had come to Chicago expecting to verify their children's safety and perhaps negotiate for their eventual return to Millbrook. Instead, they found themselves confronting the possibility that taking their children away from the Foundation might actually harm their long-term prospects. The most difficult conversation occurred on the second evening of their visit, when Jonathan Westbrook invited the parents to dinner in his private quarters within the main building. His living space was comfortable but not ostentatious, filled with books, photographs of children who had graduated from the Foundation's programs, and mementos from his travels to other communities facing crises similar to Millbrook's. "I know what you're thinking," Westbrook said as they settled in his sitting room after dinner. "You're wondering whether your children would be better served by remaining here rather than returning to Millbrook, even after your community recovers." Sarah felt tears welling up at having her secret thoughts spoken aloud. "Mr. Westbrook, we love our children more than life itself. But what we've seen here, the opportunities you're providing, how can we take them away from all this?" Westbrook's expression was compassionate but serious. "Mrs. Mitchell, that's exactly the question my grandfather struggled with when he left Millbrook in 1889. He could have taken some of the local children with him to Chicago, given them opportunities there families couldn't provide. But he believed that breaking up families was a form of violence, even when done with good intentions." Emma Rodriguez leaned forward. "But our situation is different. We chose to send our children here. We made that decision freely." "Did you?" Westbrook asked gently. "Or were you forced into that choice by circumstances beyond your control?" The distinction was crucial, though its implications were complex. The parents had indeed made a voluntary decision to participate in the auction, but that choice had been constrained by the reality that their children might otherwise starve. Frank Morrison voiced what all three parents were thinking. "Mr. Westbrook, if we decided that our children should remain here permanently, would that be possible?" "Of course," Westbrook replied immediately. "The Foundation has legal guardianship of all the children placed here until their families specifically request their return. But, Mr. Morrison, I want you to understand what permanent placement would mean. He explained that children who remained at the foundation through their teenage years typically graduated with educational credentials equivalent to college preparation. Most went on to universities or professional training programs. Many eventually settled in cities and pursued careers that took them far from their rural origins. In essence, Westbrook said, choosing to leave your children here would mean choosing to transform them into entirely different people than they would have become in Millbrook. They would gain opportunities but lose connections to their roots, their community, their heritage. Sarah felt the weight of this decision crushing down on her. How could any parent make such a choice? How could she decide between her son's immediate safety and happiness versus his connection to family and community? How could she choose between his potential for professional success and his understanding of where he came from? The conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's voices in the hallway outside. Evening study hall was ending, and students were returning to their dormitories. Through the window, Sarah could see Tommy walking with his new friends, engaged in animated discussion about something they had learned that day. "There's something else you need to consider," Westbrook said quietly. "The Foundation's mission isn't just to rescue individual children. We're also committed to helping communities recover from the crises that create displacement in the first place." He explained that the money paid for the children's placement was only the beginning of the Foundation's involvement with Millbrook. They had already begun discussions with state agricultural experts about soil improvement and crop diversification. They were exploring the possibility of establishing small manufacturing operations that could provide year-round employment. Most ambitiously, they were considering funding the construction of a railroad spur that would connect Millbrook to broader markets. "Our goal," Westbrook said, "is to make Millbrook the kind of community where children like yours can thrive without having to leave their families behind." The revelation reframed everything once again. The mysterious benefactor wasn't just saving children, he was working to save the community that had produced those children. The Foundation's long-term vision involved transforming Millbrook into a place where the auction would never again be necessary. "How long would such improvements take?" Sarah asked. "Realistically, 3 to 5 years for significant change. Perhaps a decade for complete transformation," Westbrook admitted. "Communities don't recover from systemic problems quickly, even with substantial investment. 3 to 5 years. Tommy would be 10 or 12 years old before Millbrook could offer him the kind of stability and opportunity he was experiencing at the Foundation. By then, his connections to his hometown might be so attenuated that returning would feel like exile rather than homecoming." That night, Sarah lay awake in the guest quarters provided for visiting families, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the impossible complexity of her situation. In the bed next to hers, Emma Rodriguez was equally sleepless, while Frank Morrison could be heard pacing in the hallway. The next morning brought their final day at the Foundation, and with it the necessity of making decisions that would shape their children's futures. Tommy appeared at breakfast with his usual enthusiasm, chattering about a science experiment he would be conducting that afternoon, and asking if Sarah wanted to see the workshop where he was learning to use real tools. As she watched her son's animated description of his activities, Sarah realized that whatever choice she made, it would involve sacrifice. Keeping Tommy at the Foundation would mean sacrificing their relationship and his connection to his heritage. Taking him back to Millbrook would mean sacrificing his access to educational and professional opportunities that could transform his entire life trajectory. The question was no longer what would keep Tommy safe. That had been answered definitively. The question was, what would serve his best interests in the long term, and whether a mother's love was sufficient justification for making such a monumental decision on his behalf. Before leaving Chicago, each parent would have to decide not just what they wanted for their children, but what they believed their children would want for themselves if they were old enough to understand the full implications of the choice. It was a burden no parent should have to bear, but it was the inevitable consequence of the desperate circumstances that had brought them to this point. The auction in Millbrook's town square had been only the beginning of a story that would ultimately challenge everything the community believed about family, sacrifice, and the meaning of love itself. The final meeting between the Millbrook parents and Jonathan Westbrook took place in the Foundation's formal library, a grand room lined with thousands of books and illuminated by tall windows that cast geometric patterns across polished wooden tables. Sarah Mitchell, Emma Rodriguez, and Frank Morrison sat facing Westbrook across an ornate conference table, each parent clutching handwritten letters their children had prepared for delivery to family members back home. Tommy's letter to his father, which Sarah had read with Westbrook's permission, contained cheerful descriptions of his daily activities and a carefully drawn picture of the Foundation's main building. But what struck Sarah most powerfully was a single line near the end. "Tell Papa I am learning to build things like he taught me, but with better tools and more wood than we ever had." The innocence of the statement underscored the complexity of their situation. Tommy wasn't rejecting his father's teachings or his Millbrook heritage. He was building upon them with resources that would never have been available in his hometown, even during prosperous times. "Before you make your final decisions about your children's future," Westbrook said, opening a leather portfolio, "there's something I need to share with you about my family's history with Millbrook. Something that goes deeper than what you discovered. In your town's records," he withdrew a collection of aged photographs and documents, spreading them carefully across the table. The images showed scenes that were unmistakably from Millbrook's early days. The original schoolhouse, families gathered for church services, children playing in streets that the current residents would recognize despite the intervening decades. "My grandfather didn't just invest in Millbrook's founding," Westbrook continued. "He was born there. Jeremiah Westbrook was the son of one of the original settlers, a family named Patterson, who changed their surname when they moved to Chicago." The revelation struck Sarah like a physical blow. Jonathan Westbrook wasn't just fulfilling a family obligation to a community his grandfather had once supported. He was helping the town where his own family had originated, where their roots extended back to the very beginning of the settlement. The Patterson family left Millbrook during the agricultural crisis of 1889, Westbrook explained, but not because they wanted to abandon their neighbors. They left because my great-grandfather believed that the only way to help Millbrook was to make enough money elsewhere to return with resources for meaningful assistance. Frank Morrison leaned forward, studying the photographs with intense concentration. "Are you saying your family has been planning to help Millbrook for almost 50 years? "Planning, watching, preparing," Westbrook confirmed. "My grandfather spent decades building the family fortune with the explicit goal of being able to intervene when Millbrook faced another crisis. He knew that agricultural communities were vulnerable to cycles of prosperity and hardship that individual families couldn't survive alone." Emma Rodriguez picked up one of the photographs, which showed a young boy standing beside a woman in period clothing. "Is this your grandfather as a child?" "That's Jeremiah at age 8, with his mother Mary Patterson," Westbrook replied. The photograph was taken in 1881, just 6 years before the crisis that forced his family to leave. He remembered what it felt like to be a child in a community facing starvation. The personal dimension of Westbrook's motivation recontextualized everything about his appearance at the auction. He hadn't been a wealthy stranger moved by newspaper reports of their desperation. He had been a descendant returning home to fulfill a multi-generational promise to the community that had shaped his family's identity. "Mr. Westbrook," Sarah said slowly. "When you stood in our town square and bid on our children, you were looking at descendants of the same families your grandfather grew up with." "Exactly," Westbrook replied, his voice carrying emotions he had previously kept carefully controlled. "Mrs. Mitchell, your maiden name was Patterson. You're actually my grandfather's distant cousin. The children I brought to Chicago aren't strangers. I'm helping out of charity. They're family." The statement reverberated through the library's silence like a thunderclap. Sarah felt her understanding of recent events shifting fundamentally. The mysterious benefactor, who had seemed too good to be true, was revealed as someone with legitimate family connections to every child he had claimed during the auction. "That's why you knew so much about Millbrook's situation," Frank realized. "You weren't just monitoring the town. You were watching over family." Westbrook nodded. "The Westbrook Educational Foundation has been tracking conditions in Millbrook for decades. We knew about the bank failures, the crop disasters, the livestock disease. We had been preparing for intervention since early 1934, but we hoped the situation would stabilize without requiring such drastic measures." He explained that the foundation had quietly provided some assistance during the preceding months. Anonymous donations to the church, medical supplies delivered without explanation, even temporary employment opportunities for some of the men who had left town seeking work. But these measures had proven insufficient as the crisis deepened. When it became clear that families were considering the auction option, Westbrook said, "We knew we had to act decisively. But I want you to understand that bringing the children to Chicago was never intended as a permanent solution. It was a rescue operation designed to preserve their lives and health while we implemented a longer-term recovery plan for Millbrook itself." Emma Rodriguez set down the photograph she had been examining. "What kind of recovery plan?" Westbrook's response revealed the true scope of his family's commitment to Millbrook's future. Over the past 3 weeks, while the children had been settling into their routines at the foundation, teams of agricultural experts, engineers, and economic development specialists had been quietly working throughout the Millbrook area. "We've identified the sources of the livestock disease that devastated your remaining animals," Westbrook explained. "It's a treatable condition that was exacerbated by malnutrition and poor sanitation resulting from the economic crisis. With proper veterinary care and improved feeding, your cattle and pig populations can be restored within 18 months. More significantly, geological surveys had revealed underground water sources that could support irrigation systems, making Millbrook's agriculture less vulnerable to drought conditions. The foundation was prepared to fund the drilling of wells and the installation of modern irrigation infrastructure that would transform farming in the region. But the most important development, Westbrook continued, is the railroad company's agreement to extend service to Millbrook. The foundation has negotiated a contract that will bring regular freight and passenger service to your community by the spring of 1936. Railroad access would revolutionize Millbrook's economic prospects. Farmers would be able to ship their products to urban markets efficiently and affordably. The town could attract small manufacturing businesses that relied on transportation infrastructure. Most importantly, Millbrook would no longer be isolated from the broader economic networks that could provide stability during future crises. The total investment in Millbrook's recovery will exceed $100,000, Westbrook revealed. That includes infrastructure, agricultural improvements, business development, and direct assistance to families during the transition period. $100,000 was a sum so vast that the parents struggled to comprehend its implications. It represented more money than Millbrook's entire economy had generated during its most prosperous years. It was enough to not just restore the community, but to transform it into something far more resilient and prosperous than it had ever been. Before, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of Westbrook's commitment. Why? She asked simply. Why invest so much in a small farming town? Westbrook's answer revealed the emotional core of his family's mission. Mrs. Mitchell, my grandfather died believing he had abandoned the community that shaped him. He spent 40 years building wealth with the single goal of returning to help Millbrook when it needed assistance again. He never lived to see that day, but he made my father promise to continue the mission. My father made the same promise to me. The Westbrook family's obligation to Millbrook wasn't just financial or practical. It was deeply personal, rooted in guilt, love, and a multi-generational commitment to proving that prosperity carried responsibilities to the communities that had fostered it. What does this mean for our children? Frank Morrison asked, voicing the question that had been underlying their entire conversation. It means you have a genuine choice, Westbrook replied. You can take your children home immediately, knowing that Millbrook will have the resources to provide them with good lives and reasonable opportunities. You can leave them here at the foundation until the community recovery is complete, then welcome them back to a town that can offer them genuine prospects for the future. Or you can decide that the educational opportunities here are so extraordinary that your children should remain permanently while maintaining strong connections to their families and their heritage. The choice was still difficult, but it was no longer impossible. Westbrook had transformed their dilemma from a decision between their children's welfare and their family relationships into a choice between different pathways to prosperity and fulfillment. There's one more thing, Westbrook said, reaching into his portfolio for a final document. The foundation would like to establish a permanent scholarship program for Millbrook children. Any family that wants to send their children here for education would be able to do so without cost, and children could return home during summers and holidays to maintain their community connections. The proposal offered something unprecedented, a bridge between Millbrook's rural heritage and the broader world of opportunities that the foundation represented. Children could experience both environments, maintaining their roots while expanding their horizons. Sarah looked at her companions and saw her own emotions reflected in their faces. Relief that their children would be safe regardless of their decision. Gratitude for Westbrook's extraordinary generosity, but also a profound sense of responsibility for making choices that would shape not just their own families, but the future of their entire community. Mr. Westbrook, she said finally, we need to discuss this with our husbands and with the other families in Millbrook. This isn't just about our individual children anymore. It's about what kind of community we want to build. Westbrook nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach, Mrs. Mitchell. These decisions should be made collectively, with full understanding of all the options available. As they prepared to return to Millbrook with news that would transform their community's understanding of its future, Sarah realized that the mysterious benefactor's true identity was less important than what his appearance had revealed about the power of family, memory, and multi-generational commitment to justice. Jonathan Westbrook had proven that prosperity carried obligations, and that sometimes the most profound acts of charity were actually acts of homecoming. The train that carried Sarah Mitchell, Emma Rodriguez, and Frank Morrison back to Indiana seemed to move with agonizing slowness, though in reality their journey from Chicago took the same 6 hours as their outbound trip. Each mile that passed brought them closer to conversations that would determine not just the fate of their own children, but the future of every family in Millbrook. Sarah stared out the window at the Indiana countryside, noting details she had missed during their anxious journey to Chicago. The farmland they passed showed the same signs of distress that had plagued Millbrook: abandoned fields, empty barns, houses with broken windows and sagging porches. The agricultural crisis that had devastated their community was part of a regional catastrophe that extended far beyond their small town's borders. But now she knew something that transformed her understanding of their situation. Jonathan Westbrook's resources weren't limited to helping Millbrook alone. The Westbrook Educational Foundation was actively working throughout the Midwest, identifying communities in crisis and implementing recovery programs that addressed both immediate needs and long-term sustainability. "Do you think the others will believe us?" Emma asked, voicing the concern that had been troubling all three parents during their return journey. Frank Morrison looked up from the detailed notes he had been taking throughout their Chicago visit. "The money speaks for itself," he said. $28,000 doesn't lie, and neither do the development plans Westbrook showed us. The development plans were indeed extraordinary. Westbrook had provided them with architectural drawings for proposed improvements to Millbrook's infrastructure, detailed budgets for agricultural modernization, and timeline projections for implementing changes that would transform their community. Within 5 years, the railroad extension alone would require 18 months of construction and represent an investment of over $40,000. The agricultural improvements, including well drilling, irrigation systems, and soil enhancement programs, would cost an additional $30,000. Business development initiatives, designed to attract small manufacturing operations to Millbrook, carried price tags that exceeded the town's entire previous economic output. But the most remarkable aspect of Westbrook's proposal wasn't its financial scope. It was the comprehensive understanding of rural community dynamics that informed every aspect of the planning. Westbrook wasn't simply throwing money at Millbrook's problems. He was implementing a carefully designed strategy that would preserve the town's essential character while eliminating the vulnerabilities that had created their current crisis. As their train pulled into the Indianapolis station for a brief stop, Sarah noticed a familiar figure waiting on the platform. Pastor William Anderson stood beside the tracks, his face showing the strain of the past 3 weeks, but also unmistakable hope. "I came to meet you," he explained, as they disembarked briefly to stretch their legs. "The whole town is waiting to hear what you discovered in Chicago. People have been gathering at the church every evening, praying for news about their children." Sarah exchanged glances with her companions. They had agreed during the journey that their revelations about Westbrook's true identity and his recovery plans for Millbrook should be shared with the entire community simultaneously, rather than filtering through individual conversations that might distort or sensationalize the information. "Pastor Anderson," she said carefully, "what we learned in Chicago will change everything about how our community understands its future. We need to call a town meeting for tomorrow evening." The pastor's eyes widened at her serious tone. "Are the children safe? Are they being treated well?" "They're more than safe," Frank Morrison replied. "But the situation is far more complex than any of us imagined. We need everyone together before we can explain properly." During the final leg of their journey to Millbrook, the three parents rehearsed how they would present their discoveries to their neighbors. The challenge was enormous. They needed to convey the extraordinary scope of Westbrook's commitment to their community while helping people understand the genuine choices now available for their children's futures. More importantly, they needed to prepare the community for decisions that would affect generations of Millbrook residents. If they accepted Westbrook's offer of comprehensive assistance, they would be entering into a partnership that would fundamentally alter their town's character and prospects. Millbrook appeared unchanged as their hired wagon approached the town limits, but Sarah now saw their community with different eyes. The empty businesses and abandoned houses that had symbolized despair just a week ago now represented opportunities for renewal. The damaged infrastructure that had seemed like evidence of inevitable decline could be transformed into the foundation for unprecedented prosperity. Main Street was busier than it had been in months, as word of the delegates' return had drawn residents from throughout the surrounding area. Sarah noticed faces she hadn't seen since before the auction. Men who had left town seeking work were beginning to return, as news spread about mysterious developments that might affect Millbrook's future. Mayor Robert Coleman met them at the town's edge, his expression mixing curiosity with barely contained anxiety. "Sarah, Emma, Frank," he said, gripping each of their hands in turn. "Please tell me you have good news about our children." "We have extraordinary news," Sarah replied. "But it's too important to summarize quickly. We need everyone together tomorrow night." The next 24 hours passed with excruciating slowness for the returning delegates. Word spread throughout Millbrook and the surrounding farming area that Sunday evening's meeting would reveal crucial information about the children's fate and potentially about the community's future. By late afternoon, wagons and automobiles were arriving from as far as 20 miles away, bringing families who had heard rumors about developments that might affect their own desperate situations. The Methodist Church was filled beyond capacity by 6 o'clock, with additional seating arranged in the basement and people standing in the aisles. Sarah estimated that over 200 people had gathered, not just Millbrook residents, but representatives from neighboring communities facing similar crises. Pastor Anderson opened the meeting with a prayer for wisdom and guidance, then introduced the 3 delegates who would report on their Chicago discoveries. Sarah had been chosen as the primary speaker, though Emma and Frank would contribute details about specific aspects of their visit. "Friends," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary, "what we learned in Chicago will challenge everything we thought we knew about our situation, about our children's future, and about our community's prospects for recovery." She started with the most important news. The children were not just safe, but thriving in ways their parents had never imagined possible. She described the Westbrook Educational Foundation's facilities, programs, and approach to child development, emphasizing that their children were receiving opportunities that would prepare them for futures far beyond what Millbrook could have offered even during prosperous times. The audience listened with rapt attention as Sarah explained the Foundation's educational philosophy, the individual attention each child received, and the remarkable progress Tommy and his classmates had already made in just 3 weeks. Several parents wiped away tears as she read excerpts from letters their children had sent home. But then Sarah moved to the revelations that would transform their understanding of their benefactor's motivations. "Jonathan Westbrook is not a stranger who took pity on our situation," she announced. "He is Jeremiah Patterson's grandson, returning to help the community where his family originated." The reaction was immediate and electric. Murmurs of recognition rippled through the crowd as older residents remembered stories about the Patterson family's departure during the 1889 crisis. Several people stood to share memories their grandparents had passed down about Jeremiah Patterson's promise to return someday with resources to help Millbrook. "But that's not the most important discovery we made," Sarah continued, raising her voice to quiet the excited conversations. "Jonathan Westbrook isn't just helping our children. He's prepared to invest over $100,000 in rebuilding our entire community." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. $100,000 was an amount beyond most people's ability to comprehend, representing more wealth than their community had seen in its entire history. Frank Morrison stepped forward to present the detailed development plans Westbrook had shared with them. He described the railroad extension, the agricultural improvements, the business development initiatives, and the timeline for implementing changes that would make Millbrook a model of rural prosperity. Within 5 years, Frank explained. Our town could have railroad service, modern farming equipment, new businesses, and economic opportunities that would attract young families instead of driving them away. Emma Rodriguez addressed the question. Everyone was thinking but hadn't yet voiced. What would accepting such assistance mean for their community's independence and character? Mr. Westbrook made it clear that his family's obligation to Millbrook doesn't include controlling our decisions, she explained. The Foundation's assistance comes with no strings attached, no requirements for how we govern ourselves or what kind of community we choose to become. Dr. Henry Walsh stood to ask the medical question that had been troubling him since learning about the children's placement. What provisions has Westbrook made for ongoing contact between children and families? How do we maintain family relationships during this transition period? Sarah's answer revealed another aspect of Westbrook's thoughtful planning. The Foundation would fund regular visits in both directions. Parents could travel to Chicago monthly to see their children, while children could return to Millbrook for extended visits during school holidays. Most importantly, any family could reclaim their children at any time, with or without explanation. The choice is entirely ours, Sarah emphasized. We can bring our children home immediately, knowing that Millbrook will have resources to provide, and them with good lives. We can leave them at the Foundation until our community recovery is complete. Or we can take advantage of the permanent scholarship program that would allow our children to benefit from both environments. Old Timothy Fletcher, whose memories of Millbrook's founding had provided crucial historical context during their research, struggled to his feet with obvious emotion. I remember when Jeremiah Patterson left town, he said, his voice shaking with age and feeling. He told my father that someday the Patterson family would return to help us. I never thought I'd live to see that promise fulfilled. The meeting continued for over 3 hours as residents asked detailed questions about every aspect of Westbrook's proposals. Some focused on practical concerns about implementation timelines and community involvement in decision-making. Others worried about potential negative consequences of accepting such extensive outside assistance. Margaret Foster, the widow who had been among the most desperate families before the auction, raised a concern that resonated throughout the room. If we accept this help, what happens to the children who chose to stay at the Foundation permanently? Do we lose them forever? Sarah's response drew upon her most profound realization from the Chicago visit. Margaret, I learned that love doesn't require possession. If our children thrive in Chicago and choose to build their lives there, we haven't lost them. We've given them wings, and Westbrook's scholarship program means they'll always have connections to home. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Pastor Anderson called for a preliminary vote to gauge community sentiment about Westbrook's proposals. The results were overwhelming. 127 families voted to accept the Foundation's assistance for community development, while only 8 expressed reservations that needed further discussion. The vote regarding individual children's placements was more complex, reflecting the personal nature of each family's circumstances. Some parents requested immediate return of their children, confident that Millbrook's improving prospects would provide adequate opportunities. Others chose to leave their children at the Foundation until the community recovery was complete. A significant number expressed interest in the scholarship program that would allow their children to benefit from both environments. But the most significant outcome of the meeting wasn't the specific votes or decisions. It was the transformation in community morale and vision for the future. For the first time since the agricultural crisis began, Millbrook's residents were planning for prosperity rather than merely surviving from day to day. As families departed the church that evening, their conversations buzzed with possibilities that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Children who had been auctioned away in desperation would return to a community transformed by unprecedented investment and opportunity. The town that had been preparing for abandonment was now planning for growth and renewal. Sarah Mitchell walked home through streets that looked the same as they had that morning, but felt entirely different. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of changes that would reshape Millbrook for generations. The mysterious Benefactor had revealed himself not as a stranger, but as family returning home to fulfill a promise that had been kept alive for nearly half a century. The auction that had torn their community apart was becoming the catalyst for bringing it back together, stronger and more prosperous than ever before. 2 years after the desperate auction that had torn Millbrook apart, Sarah Mitchell stood on the platform of the town's brand-new railroad depot, watching the afternoon. Train from Chicago approached through the autumn landscape. The sight still filled her with wonder. Gleaming steel rails, where once there had been only dirt roads, a modern brick station building where corn stubble had grown during the hungry times, and most remarkably, the sound of a locomotive whistle, announcing prosperity instead of departure. The train that would soon arrive carried 23 children home for Thanksgiving break, including Tommy, now 9 years old, and transformed in ways that went far beyond his physical growth. Through the monthly visits that Jonathan Westbrook had funded, Sarah had watched her son evolve into a confident, articulate young person who moved easily between two worlds, the sophisticated educational environment of the Westbrook Foundation and the rural community that had shaped his earliest years. But today's homecoming was special for reasons that went beyond the holiday celebration. After 2 years of careful planning and gradual implementation, Jonathan Westbrook was finally ready to reveal the complete truth about his family's connection to Millbrook, a truth that would transform the community's understanding of its own history and destiny. The transformation of Millbrook itself had exceeded even Westbrook's optimistic projections. The railroad extension, completed 6 months ahead of schedule, had brought immediate economic benefits that rippled through every aspect of community life. Farmers could now ship their products to Chicago markets efficiently, receiving prices that were 30% higher than the previous system of wagon transport to distant rail connections. More importantly, the railroad had attracted 3 small manufacturing operations to establish facilities in Millbrook. A furniture workshop employed 12 local men in skilled woodworking that utilized timber from surrounding forests. A textile mill provided employment for 15 women, producing high-quality fabrics that were shipped throughout the Midwest. Most significantly, a precision tool-making shop had been established by German immigrants who recognized Millbrook's potential as a center for specialized manufacturing. The agricultural improvements had been equally dramatic. The well drilling program had revealed underground water sources that supported irrigation systems throughout the surrounding farmland. Modern equipment purchased through Westbrook's Agricultural Development Fund had increased crop yields by over 60%. The veterinary program had eliminated the livestock diseases that had devastated local herds, and new breeding programs were producing cattle and pigs that commanded premium prices in urban markets. But the most remarkable change in Millbrook was intangible. The transformation of community spirit from resignation to optimism. The town that had once been preparing for abandonment was now planning expansion. New families were arriving monthly, drawn by economic opportunities and the reputation Millbrook was developing as a model of rural prosperity. The population had grown from 847 to over 1,200 residents, requiring the construction of new housing, expansion of the school system, and establishment of additional businesses to serve the growing community. The general store that had stood empty during the crisis now anchored a thriving commercial district that included a proper bank, a medical clinic staffed by 2 physicians, and even a small hotel for business travelers and visiting families. As the train pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and squealing of brakes, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of joy and apprehension that accompanied her son's returns from Chicago. Tommy had grown 3 inches during his time at the foundation, but more significantly, he had developed an intellectual sophistication and cultural awareness that sometimes made conversation challenging for his parents. During his last visit, Tommy had spoken knowledgeably about mechanical engineering principles he was studying, discussed books by authors Sarah had never heard of, and demonstrated musical abilities that had developed through formal instruction at the foundation. While she was proud of his growth, she sometimes wondered whether the gap between Tommy's expanding world and her own limited experience would eventually become unbridgeable. The children who disembarked from the train that afternoon represented a fascinating study in adaptation and growth. Each had been shaped by their time at the Westbrook Foundation, but each had also maintained connections to Millbrook that influenced their development in unique ways. Maria and Sofia Rodriguez had become accomplished musicians, but they incorporated folk melodies from their Mexican heritage into their classical training. David Morrison had developed into a natural leader at the foundation, but he used organizational skills learned in Millbrook's agricultural community to coordinate group projects among his Chicago classmates. Most remarkably, Lucy Henderson had discovered a talent for scientific observation that her teachers believed could lead to a career in medical research. But her studies often focused on rural health issues and agricultural science that reflected her ongoing connection to farming communities. Tommy rushed to embrace his parents with an enthusiasm that immediately reassured Sarah about their continuing relationship. Despite his sophisticated education and urban experiences, he remained fundamentally the same warm, affectionate child who had left Millbrook 2 years earlier. "Mama, Papa," he said excitedly, "wait until you see what Mr. Westbrook brought for the whole town to see. It's in a special car at the end of the train." Indeed, the locomotive had pulled an unusual cargo car that was drawing curious crowds of Millbrook residents. Jonathan Westbrook himself stood beside the car, directing the careful unloading of wooden crates that appeared to contain delicate items wrapped in protective materials. "Sarah, James," Westbrook called, approaching the Mitchell family with the warmth that had characterized their relationship since that first difficult meeting in Chicago. "I'm glad you're here for this moment. What we're unveiling today will complete the circle that began when my great-grandfather left Millbrook in 1889. The crates contained historical artifacts that Westbrook had been collecting for decades in preparation for this moment. As community members gathered in the town square, he began unpacking items that told the complete story of Millbrook's founding and the Patterson family's role in its early development. The first revelation came in the form of original surveying, maps from 1847, showing that the land on which Millbrook was built had been purchased not by a consortium of investors, as local history had recorded, but by a single individual, Josiah Patterson, Jeremiah's father, and Jonathan Westbrook's great-great-grandfather. "Millbrook wasn't just a community my family helped establish," Westbrook explained to the assembled crowd. "It was a community my family created specifically as a refuge for people fleeing economic hardship in eastern cities." The historical documents revealed that Josiah Patterson had been born into poverty in Philadelphia, where he had witnessed the devastating effects of urban economic cycles on working families. After achieving success in railroad construction, he had used his wealth to purchase land in Indiana, with the specific goal of creating a community where families could achieve genuine economic security through agricultural self-sufficiency. "My great-great-grandfather designed Millbrook as an experiment in economic democracy," Westbrook continued, displaying architectural plans that showed how the town's original layout had been carefully designed to prevent the concentration of wealth and power that characterized most 19th-century communities. The original plan had allocated equal-sized plots to all families, with community ownership of essential facilities like the grain mill and general store. Most remarkably, the founding documents included provisions for collective assistance during economic crises, ensuring that no family would face starvation or displacement due to circumstances beyond their control. But the most important document, Westbrook said, producing a leather-bound journal, is my great-great-grandfather's personal record of his vision for Millbrook's future. The journal entries, written in Josiah Patterson's careful handwriting, revealed a man who had dedicated his life to proving that prosperity could be shared equitably within a community that prioritized collective welfare over individual wealth accumulation. But the entries also revealed his growing concern about external economic forces that threatened communities like Millbrook. My great-great-grandfather understood that agricultural communities would always be vulnerable to forces beyond their control, Westbrook explained. Weather, market fluctuations, transportation costs, credit availability, all of these could destroy even the most well-planned community if families faced them alone. The journal's final entries, written shortly before Josiah Patterson's death in 1885, outlined a comprehensive plan for ensuring Millbrook's long-term survival. He had established a trust fund that would grow over time, eventually providing resources for community assistance during future crises. Most importantly, he had made his descendants promise to maintain oversight of Millbrook's welfare and to intervene whenever the community faced existential threats. When my grandfather, Jeremiah, was forced to leave Millbrook during the 1889 crisis, Westbrook continued, he wasn't abandoning the community. He was implementing his father's plan by leaving to build the resources necessary for future assistance. The revelation reframed the entire history of the Patterson family's departure from Millbrook. Instead of being driven away by economic hardship, they had made a strategic decision to temporarily sacrifice their connection to the community in order to develop the financial capabilities that would allow them to fulfill their multi-generational obligations. The Westbrook Educational Foundation, the agricultural development programs, the railroad extension, all of the assistance we've provided to Millbrook, none of it represents charity, Westbrook explained. It represents the fulfillment of a 150-year-old promise to ensure that this community would never face destruction due to economic forces beyond its control. Dr. Henry Walsh, who had been listening with fascination to these historical revelations, stepped forward with a question that had been troubling him since learning about the scope of Westbrook's assistance. Jonathan, if your family's obligation to Millbrook was established so long ago, why did you wait until our situation became desperate? Why didn't you intervene earlier to prevent the crisis? Westbrook's answer revealed the most complex aspect of his family's stewardship philosophy. Dr. Walsh, my great-great-grandfather, believed that communities needed to maintain their independence and self-reliance except during true emergencies. Premature intervention could create dependency that would weaken rather than strengthen a community's long-term prospects. The Westbrook family had indeed been monitoring Millbrook's situation throughout the early years of the Great Depression, but they had deliberately avoided intervention as long as the community was finding ways to cope with its challenges independently. Only when families began considering the auction of their children had the situation crossed the threshold that triggered the family's emergency assistance protocols. But now that the immediate crisis has passed, Westbrook continued, I can reveal the final element of my family's plan for Millbrook's future. He produced a legal document that represented the culmination of 150 years of careful planning. The Westbrook Family Trust was transferring complete ownership of all development projects in Millbrook to the community itself, along with an endowment fund that would ensure ongoing financial security for generations to come. Millbrook is being deeded back to its residents, Westbrook announced, along with sufficient resources to maintain independence indefinitely. The endowment fund totaled over $300,000, invested in diversified securities that would provide annual income sufficient to fund community infrastructure, education, and emergency assistance programs without requiring outside support. Most importantly, the fund's management would be controlled entirely by Millbrook residents through a democratically elected board. "My family's obligation to Millbrook is now complete," Westbrook said. "You have the resources, the infrastructure, and the community organization necessary to prosper independently. Our role changes from guardians to partners, available for consultation and friendship, but no longer responsible for your welfare." Sarah Mitchell found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Westbrook had accomplished. The mysterious benefactor, who had appeared during their darkest hour, had not only rescued their children and rebuilt their community, but had also ensured that future generations would never face the desperation that had forced them to auction their own children. But the day held one more surprise that would complete the emotional circle of their extraordinary journey. Tommy approached his parents with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mama, Papa," he said, "I need to tell you about the decision I've made about my future." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, fearing that her son was about to announce his intention to remain permanently in Chicago, pursuing opportunities that would take him far from Millbrook forever. "I want to finish my education at the Westbrook Foundation," Tommy continued, "because I want to become an engineer who specializes in helping rural communities. Mr. Westbrook has shown me that there are hundreds of towns like Millbrook that need the kind of help we received." Tommy's announcement revealed the most profound impact of the Westbrook Foundation's educational philosophy. The children who had been rescued from Millbrook's crisis were not being trained to abandon their rural heritage in favor of urban opportunities. They were being prepared to become the next generation of community builders, equipped with sophisticated skills, but motivated by connections to the agricultural communities that had shaped their values. "I want to learn everything I can about engineering, agriculture, and business," Tommy explained, "so that someday I can help other towns the way Mr. Westbrook helped us. But I also want to come home to Millbrook and help our community continue growing and prospering." The announcement was echoed by other Millbrook children who had been transformed by their experiences at the foundation. Maria Rodriguez wanted to establish a music program that would serve rural communities throughout the Midwest. David Morrison planned to study agricultural science with the goal of developing farming techniques specifically adapted to small communities. Lucy Henderson hoped to become a doctor who would provide medical services to rural areas that couldn't otherwise afford professional health care. Each child had been shaped by their time away from Millbrook, but each had also been inspired to use their education in service of communities like the one that had produced them. The Westbrook Foundation had succeeded in breaking the cycle that typically drew talented young people away from rural areas and into urban centers where their skills served different populations. As the Thanksgiving celebration continued into the evening, with families reunited and the community gathered to share food and gratitude, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of unprecedented prosperity and security. 2 years earlier, she had stood in this same town square, watching her son disappear into uncertainty, convinced that she might never see him again. Now she watched him playing with friends who had shared his experiences, planning a future that would honor both his expanded education and his rural heritage. Jonathan Westbrook had proven that wealth carried responsibilities, that communities could be transformed through careful planning and generous investment. and that love sometimes required the courage to let children grow beyond their original circumstances while maintaining connections to their roots. But perhaps, most importantly, he had demonstrated that promises made in desperation could be fulfilled across generations, that families could honor obligations to communities even when those communities had forgotten the connections, and that the most profound acts of charity were actually acts of justice, the fulfillment of moral debts that transcended individual relationships. The auction that had torn Millbrook apart had become the catalyst for bringing it back together, stronger, more prosperous, and more secure than ever before. The children who had been sold to ensure their survival had become the architects of their community's renaissance, and the mysterious benefactor who had appeared in their darkest hour had revealed himself to be what he had been all along: family, returning home to fulfill a promise that love and prosperity carried obligations to ensure that no community would ever again be forced to choose between survival and the sanctity of family bonds. As the evening star appeared above Millbrook's transformed skyline, Sarah Mitchell held her son's hand and watched the lights twinkle in windows throughout their thriving community, knowing that the story that had begun in desperation had ended in triumph that would echo through generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.